I knew something was wrong the second I flipped the kitchen switch, and nothing happened. Not a flicker, not a hum, not even that tiny electric buzz old houses make when they are trying their best to stay alive. My refrigerator was dead silent. The ceiling fan was frozen over the table, and the whole house felt like it was holding its breath, which is a very strange thing to feel in a place you have called home for almost 11 years. And before anybody says, maybe it was just a storm or a bad breaker. No, this was not weather. This was not bad wiring. This was a woman with a clipboard and too much confidence, deciding she had the right to reach into my life and turn off the lights. My name is Marion Cole, and up until that summer, I had a very simple life on a little bend of water called Juniper Sound, just outside a town where everybody still waves at the gas station even when they absolutely know your business. My house was nothing fancy. A cedar-sided cottage with a crooked porch, a dock that leaned a little to the left, and a backyard full of wild lavender, tomato cages, bird feeders, and one ceramic frog my sister bought me as a joke after my divorce. I kept that frog right by the steps because it made me laugh, and at that point in my life, I had learned not to apologize for small things that helped. I'd moved there after my marriage ended, not in some dramatic movie way where I threw clothes into a suitcase and drove until I found myself, but more like the exhausted, middle-aged version of starting over, where you sign too many papers, cry in a grocery store parking lot once, then buy a house because it has morning light in the kitchen and you can finally hear your own thoughts. For years, Juniper Sound was quiet in the best way. I drank coffee barefoot on the porch, watched herons stalk the shallows like they owned the place, and spent Saturdays pretending I knew what I was doing in the garden. Then Bellamy Shores arrived. That was the name of the new gated community they built on the old pine acreage across the road. Though if you ask me, Bellamy Shores sounded less like a neighborhood and more like a hotel shampoo. It came in pieces at first. Survey flags, bulldozers, temporary fencing, men in hard hats pointing at dirt. Then suddenly there were stone entrance columns, black iron gates, identical coastal grey houses, and landscaping so perfect it looked nervous. They had rules for everything: mailbox height, approved mulch colors, window treatments, visible from the street, acceptable porch furniture, even seasonal decorations, which I only knew because one of the workers accidentally left a welcome packet in my mailbox, and I read it with the same fascination people have when they slow down near an accident. The important thing was this: I was not part of Bellamy Shores. My cottage sat on a separate parcel that had been there since the 1950s. Long before anyone decided the shoreline needed branding, I had my own deed, my own driveway, my own utility account, my own taxes, my own problems, and absolutely no interest in paying monthly dues so someone named a committee could tell me my frog lacked coastal elegance. But then I met Denise Larkin. Denise was the president of the Bellamy Shores Residential Association, and she had the kind of smile that looked laminated. The first time she came up my driveway, she did not knock so much as arrive, wearing white slacks, gold earrings, and carrying a leather folder pressed against her chest like evidence. I was kneeling by the rosemary, hands dirty, hair clipped up badly, and she said, "Mrs. Cole, we need to talk about visual continuity." Now, I've been called a lot of things in my life: stubborn, practical, too sarcastic before noon, but never a threat to visual continuity. I stood up, wiped my hands on my shorts, and said, "I am sorry. What exactly is visually discontinuing you today?" She did not laugh. That should have been my first warning. She explained that my property sat within the community view corridor, which was apparently a phrase people use when they do not own your land, but want to behave like they do. She said my windspinner was too reflective. My garden looked informal. My porch chairs did not align with Bellamy Shores' exterior standards, and the frog, God bless him, created what she called a whimsical distraction. I told her, "Denise, this house is not in your association." She nodded the way adults nod at toddlers holding markers near a wall and said, "We understand there are legacy parcels involved, but cooperation benefits everyone." That was how she talked. Always soft, always polished, always making control sound like community spirit. Over the next few months, she kept showing up, sometimes in person, sometimes by letter, sometimes through little printed notices placed under my windshield wiper when I parked near the boat ramp, as if my 2012 Subaru was now a fugitive from good taste. One notice said my dock lights were warmer in tone than Bellamy guidelines preferred. Another said my compost bin was visible from the northeast walking path, a path Bellamy built after my house already existed, which felt like someone moving their dining table next to your bathroom window and then complaining about privacy. I ignored most of it, because life is too short to argue with people who alphabetize their grievances, but I would be lying if I said it did not get under my skin. It was not the frog or the chairs or the mulch. It was the assumption. Denise did not hate my house because it was ugly. She hated it because it was uncontrolled. It sat there at the edge of their perfect little brochure world, older, messier, independent, with tomatoes climbing wire cages and wind chimes singing when the lake breeze came through, reminding everyone who drove past those gates that not everything can be purchased, standardized, and approved by committee. The tension might have stayed petty if Denise had been satisfied with annoying me, but people like that usually are not looking for compliance. They are looking for proof that their authority reaches as far as they imagine it does. That proof came on a Thursday in late August, one of those hot, wet afternoons where the air feels like a towel straight from the dryer. I've been in town picking up prescriptions for my neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, who lived 2 houses down and had a hip predicted rain better than the news. When I pulled into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was my porch fan was not spinning. Then I opened the door and felt it, that heavy indoor heat, the kind that tells you the air conditioning has been off long enough for the walls to warm up. I checked the breaker box. Nothing had tripped. I checked the outage map on my phone. Nothing nearby. Then I called the electric company, expecting a bored customer service rep to tell me a transformer had blown or a squirrel had made a poor life choice. Instead, after putting me on hold twice, the woman on the line came back with a voice that had changed. She said, "Mrs. One of those, coal, according to our system. Service to your address was disconnected to a consolidated community utilities account held by Bellamy Shores Residential Association." I remember standing in the hall, staring at the thermostat screen gone blank, and saying, "That is impossible, because I do not belong to Bellamy Shores." There was a pause, and not a small pause either. The kind of pause where somebody on the other end is reading something they suddenly wish they were not reading. She said the account had been grouped under a shared billing structure several weeks earlier, and a disconnect order had been processed through the managing account holder. I asked her who requested it. She would not say Denise's name, but she did not have to. My whole body went cold in a house that was almost 89 degrees. I got in my car, drove straight to the Bellamy Shores office, and I wish I could tell you I had some perfect speech prepared, something sharp and cinematic. But honestly, I was too stunned for poetry. I was thinking about the food spoiling in my refrigerator, about my medication in the bathroom cabinet, about what would have happened if I had been older, sick, or out of town for 3 days. The office was inside their clubhouse, all glass and pale wood and soft instrumental music, the kind of place designed to make unreasonable things feel official. Denise was behind a white desk, calm as a cat in a sunbeam, and when she saw me, she smiled like she had been expecting me. I said, "You shut off my power." She folded her hands and said, "We initiated a compliance-related utility adjustment." I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because my brain needed somewhere to put the shock. A compliance-related utility adjustment. Denise, that is a cute word to say you cut electricity to a house you do not own. Her smile tightened. "Marion, your property has repeatedly refused to cooperate with community standards, and under the expanded shoreline management interpretation, Bellamy Shores has authority over shared visual and service zones." I leaned forward and put both hands on her desk. "No, you have landscaping opinions and a gate code. That is not authority." For the first time, her eyes changed. Not much. Just a flicker, but enough to show me the person underneath the polished voice. She said notices was sent. I said, "You can send me a notice saying the moon belongs to your board. That does not make it true." The room went quiet then, except for that ridiculous spa music bubbling through the speakers. Denise stood up slowly and told me she was trying to protect property values. And there it was, the real heart of it. Not safety, not community, not service, property values. My old cottage, my wild lavender, my dock lights, my ridiculous frog. They were not violations. They were reminders that her perfect neighborhood had limits. I left before I said something that would make me look like the problem. But by the time I reached my car, my hands had stopped shaking. Something inside me had clicked into place. I was not going to scream, and I was not going to beg. I was going to find every paper, every map, every agreement, every quiet little line they thought nobody would ever read, because Denise had not just crossed a boundary. She had shown me exactly where to start digging. That night, I turned my dining table into the saddest little legal war room you have ever seen. Just me, a lukewarm bottle of water, a flashlight, 3 boxes of old paperwork, and one angry ceramic frog sitting on the windowsill like he had been promoted to emotional support council. The power came back on later that evening, which should have made me feel better, but it actually made me angrier, because that meant the outage had never been some complicated technical emergency. It had been a switch someone believed they had the right to pull. I started with my deed, then my closing documents, then old survey maps from when my parcel was still called Lot 14B on the county books, back before Bellamy Shores existed as anything more than pine trees, mosquitoes, and somebody's dream of selling coastal peace at luxury prices. I read until the words blurred. I made coffee at midnight, then hated myself for making coffee at midnight, then drank it anyway because there are moments in life when sleep feels like surrender. By 2 in the morning, I had one thing clear. My property was independent, not adjacent but included, not exempt but still governed, independent. My driveway connected to county road frontage. My water line was separate. My septic permit was separate. My tax bill named me and only me. There was no covenant, no association membership, no architectural control clause, no signature from me, no signature from the previous owner. Nothing Denise could point to unless she planned to staple her feelings to a legal document and call it evidence. The next morning, I went to the county records office, which is not exactly where you go if you want glamour, but it is where truth goes to sit under fluorescent lights. Behind the counter was a woman named Ruth Pemberton, who looked about 70, wore red reading glasses on a chain, and had the calm authority of someone who had watched 3 generations of developers try to bully their way through zoning rules. I told her I needed subdivision filings for Bellamy Shores, shoreline service maps, and anything related to utility consolidation near Juniper Sound. Ruth looked at me over her glasses and said, "Honey, that is either a very boring morning or a very interesting lawsuit." I said, "I am hoping for boring." She said, "They never are." She was right. The Bellamy Shores subdivision filing was thick, polished, expensive, and full of the kind of language developers use when they want a pine forest to sound like a lifestyle opportunity. But buried behind the marketing words and plat maps was the important part. The association authority applied only to recorded lots within Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the Bellamy Shores development, plus common elements specifically transferred to the association. My lot was not listed, it was not shaded, it was not referenced. It was outside the boundary line by 37 feet at the narrowest point, which, in legal terms, is not almost theirs, it is mine. Then Ruth pulled the utility agreement, and that is where the story stopped being just about Denise being pushy and started getting strange. Bellamy Shores had negotiated a consolidated service arrangement with Coastal Grid Power for all internal streetlights, gate operations, clubhouse service, irrigation pumps, security equipment, and residential units inside the development. It made sense for them. One master account, one association billing cycle, one clean system. The problem was that during a service map update, someone had marked the entire shoreline access lane as part of the Bellamy service zone, including my address, Mr. Alvarez's old boathouse meter, and a vacant bait shop parcel nobody had used since 1998. Ruth leaned closer to the map and tapped my address with one acrylic nail. "Well now," she said, "that is sloppy." I asked her if sloppy meant illegal. She said, "Sloppy means expensive once people start pretending it is not sloppy." I went home with copies of everything and called Coastal Grid again, this time not as a confused homeowner sweating in a dark kitchen, but as a woman with page numbers. I asked for account administration, then legal compliance, and finally a man named Grant came on the line, and Grant had the tired voice of somebody who'd been handed a folder nobody wanted to own. I gave him my address, the Bellamy master account number from the paperwork, the county filing reference, and the service map date. There was a long silence, then typing, then another silence. He said, "Mrs. Cole, I can confirm your meter is currently nested under the Bellamy Shores Master Service Agreement." I said, "Nested is a sweet word, Grant, but I did not crawl in there." He cleared his throat. "No, ma'am. It appears to have been included during a zone consolidation. I asked him whether Bellamy had the right to disconnect my individual service if I was not a member of the association. He got very careful then, the way people get when every word suddenly has a lawyer hiding behind it. He said a managing account holder can request service actions on meters within a master account, but if a meter is incorrectly included, the remedy is formal separation, not discretionary enforcement. I wrote that down so hard the pen tore the paper. Formal separation, not discretionary enforcement. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Until separation is complete, who is financially responsible for the meter? Grant went quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, under the current structure, charges flow to the master account holder. I looked across my kitchen at the frog, and I swear that ugly little thing looked proud of me. I said, so if Bellamy Shores does not file the separation paperwork, my electricity remains on their account. Grant said, that is the current system behavior. Yes, system behavior, another sweet little phrase for a giant mess. I asked what separation required. He said the association would need to submit corrected boundary documentation, pay a restructuring fee, obtain county confirmation, and accept a review period that could affect their consolidated rate plan. In plain English, Denise had tried to use the utility system like a leash, but she had clipped the other end to her own ankle. Now, let me be clear, because I know somebody in the comments will say I was stealing electricity. I was not. I kept paying into an escrow account every month. The exact amount my normal bill would have been based on the year before, because my father raised me Catholic and practical, and even when you are furious, you keep receipts. I sent Denise one certified letter. Not emotional, not dramatic, just clean. I stated that Bellamy Shores had no legal authority over my property, that my meter appeared to have been incorrectly absorbed into their master service agreement, that any attempt to interrupt service again would be treated as intentional interference, and that I would continue preserving funds equal to my estimated usage until the account was properly separated or a court directed otherwise. I copied Coastal Grid, the county utility office, and, because I was feeling petty in a responsible way, the Bellamy Shores Association board. 3 days later, Denise called. I let it ring twice because I am not a saint, then answered. Her voice was smooth at first. Marion, I received your letter, and I think there has been a misunderstanding. I said, Denise, you cut off my power. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a decision with paperwork. She said, the association was operating under guidance that your parcel was part of the shoreline service zone. I said, funny, because last week it was an expanded management interpretation. Did the vocabulary get a lawyer? She did not like that. I could hear it in the pause. Then she shifted into that boardroom tone again and said, regardless, your continued usage under our community account is not authorized. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the lake, calm in a way that almost surprised me. I said, then file the separation. Another pause. She said, it is not that simple. And there it was. The first honest thing she had said to me in months. I said, I know. That is why you should not have touched it. Over the next few weeks, Bellamy Shores became very busy pretending not to panic. I got emails with subject lines like utility clarification notice and interim community resource concern, which sounded serious until you read them and realized they were just Denise trying to scold me with a thesaurus. The board treasurer, a nervous man named Paul Sutter, came by one morning while I was watering basil and asked if we could resolve things neighbor to neighbor. I told him I would have loved to do that before his association turned my house into a hostage with a meter number. Paul looked genuinely embarrassed, which made me feel a little bad for him, but not enough to rescue him from the consequences of attending meetings with Denise Larkin and nodding along. He admitted the separation fee was higher than expected, and worse. If Coastal Grid reopened the master agreement, Bellamy could lose the discounted rate they had promised residents during the sales campaign. That was the motive, finally sitting right there in the sunlight between my tomato plants. Denise had wanted control. Yes, but the association wanted something bigger. A clean, marketable shoreline zone where everything looked unified and every service line made their development seem seamless. My cottage was a loose thread. Pulling it would admit the sweater had never been perfect, so they tried pressure first, then paperwork, then the switch. But now the same system they used to pressure me had turned into a monthly reminder that I was not the only one with something to lose. The first JED bill arrived in September. I knew because Paul accidentally forwarded me an internal email, then recalled it, which, as everyone knows, is just the digital equivalent of yelling "do not look" while handing someone binoculars. My usage was on there. Not huge, not outrageous, just normal, a refrigerator, a fan, lights, an old air conditioner doing its best against southern humidity. But you would have thought I had plugged in a carnival. Denise wrote, "This is unacceptable and must be corrected immediately." The accountant replied, "Correction requires master account amendment. Coastal Grid estimated review period at 90 to 120 days with possible rate renegotiation." Then Paul wrote, "Can we ask her to reimburse?" Denise replied, "She is refusing association authority." I smiled at that, because refusing association authority sounded so much more elegant than lead my frog alone. By October, Denise tried intimidation. She sent a letter saying Bellamy Shores reserved all rights regarding unauthorized consumption of shared community resources. I wrote back asking her to identify the recorded instrument that made my private home a shared community resource. She did not answer. In November, she claimed my escrow arrangement proved I knew I owed them money. I replied that my escrow arrangement proved I was acting in good faith while they corrected their administrative error. In December, she had an attorney send the letter that used the phrase unjust enrichment 3 times, which was impressive considering the only person enriched so far was Coastal Grid. My attorney, a calm little bulldog named Nora Fields, responded with copies of the subdivision plat, the utility agreement, my certified letter, and a sentence I still keep in a folder because it is one of the prettiest things I have ever paid for. It said, "The association cannot simultaneously deny Mrs. Cole's membership, assert control over her utilities, demand compliance with its internal standards, and avoid responsibility for the account structure it created." I read that sentence 6 times. Then I made tea. By spring, the Bellamy board meetings had become the hottest ticket in town. Not officially, of course, but small towns do not need official channels when gossip has legs. Mr. Alvarez heard from his niece, who did landscaping for 3 Bellamy houses, that residents were angry about rising dues, and Denise was blaming unexpected utility restructuring expenses. Nobody mentioned that those expenses began when their president picked a fight with a widow, a frog, and a filing cabinet. Then one afternoon, almost 7 months after the power outage, I saw Denise standing at the edge of my driveway. No clipboard this time. No folder. Just sunglasses, a cream sweater, and a face that looked like she had swallowed a lemon politely. I walked out onto the porch and waited. She looked at the wind chimes, the lavender, the crooked dock, and finally at me. "Marianne," she said, "the board is prepared to discuss a resolution." I said, "Good. Start with an apology." Her jaw moved slightly. "We regret the confusion." I said, "No, Denise. Confusion is when you forget where you parked. You cut off electricity to my house because you thought I would get scared and fall in line. Say that part correctly." For a second, I thought she might turn around and leave, and maybe part of me wanted her to, because anger is easier when people stay villains all the way through. But she stayed. She looked smaller without the office around her, without the desk and glass walls and spa music. Just a woman, standing in my driveway at the edge of a lake she'd tried to make look more expensive than honest. She said, "I made a decision based on incomplete information." I said, "You made a decision based on power. The information was available. You just did not think I would read it." And that was the moment I realized the fight had already changed. It was not about electricity anymore. It was about whether a person with a quiet house and an old deed could still hold the line when a polished system decided she was inconvenient. The resolution meeting happened 2 weeks later, not in Denise's glassy little clubhouse office, which I considered a small personal victory, but at the county utility annex, a beige brick building with bad coffee, plastic chairs, and the kind of lighting that makes everybody look equally guilty. I brought Nora, my attorney, because I had learned by then that when people say they just want to talk, what they usually mean is they want you to come alone and be reasonable in the exact way that benefits them. Denise brought 2 board members, Paul the nervous treasurer, a man named Victor who looked like he had never met assignments he could not fill, and a utility compliance officer from Coastal Grid named Grant who looked even more tired in person than he sounded on the phone. The meeting started with Denise saying Bellamy Shores had always acted in the best interests of the community. And I will give her this. She could make a sentence walk in circles without ever getting tired. Nora let her talk for almost 5 minutes, then slid a folder across the table and said, "Let's skip the brochure language and discuss liability." I almost applauded, but I was trying to look like a mature adult with legal representation. Grant explained the situation in the driest way possible, which somehow made it more satisfying. My meter had been incorrectly included in the Bellamy Master Service Zone. Bellamy had used that status to request a disconnect. The disconnect should not have been used as a compliance tool, and separation would require corrected maps, administrative review, a restructuring charge, and possible changes to Bellamy's consolidated rate. Every time he said restructuring charge, Paul looked like he aged 3 months. Victor finally leaned forward and said, "So she gets free power because of a paperwork mistake?" I said, "No, Victor. I get uninterrupted service because your association created a paperwork mistake, weaponized it, and then discovered paperwork has edges." He blinked at me like nobody had ever spoken to him in a full sentence he could not interrupt, nor explained that I had placed my estimated payments in escrow every month, which removed any argument that I was trying to profit from the mistake. What remained was Bellamy's problem, not mine, because they had taken an administrative error and turned it into an act of control. Denise kept her eyes on the table. That was new. Usually she watched people like she was grading them. Grant then confirmed that if Bellamy wanted immediate separation, they would have to absorb the restructuring cost and file the corrected boundary package. But if they delayed, charges would continue to flow through their master account until the review was complete. Denise asked how long the review would take. Grant said, "Given the incorrect service map and the prior disconnect action, it may take 6 to 9 months. The room went so quiet I could hear the vending machine humming behind us. That was the real punishment. Not some dramatic fine, not a judge banging a gavel. Just the slow, bureaucratic music of consequences. In the end, Bellamy agreed to file the correction, pay the restructuring costs, stop contacting me about association standards, stop placing notices on my property, and acknowledge in writing that my parcel was not part of Bellamy Shores and never had been." Denise tried to make the acknowledgement mutual, as if we had both made mistakes, and Nora said no, just like that. One word, clean as a snapped branch. So Denise signed, Paul signed, Grant signed off on the utility process. I signed only the escrow release terms, which meant once my meter was properly separated, the money I'd set aside would go toward my actual usage, not toward Denise's little fantasy that she owned my porch. You might think that was the ending, but life is rarely that neat. The correction took almost a full year from the day they cut my power, and during that year Bellamy Shores kept receiving bills that included my house. Each month, I deposited my estimate into escrow. Each month, their accounting department paid the master bill. Each month, Denise had to explain to residents why the association budget was still tangled in a utility review without saying, because I tried to bully a woman with old survey maps and lost. And that is where the story spread. Not because I told everyone, although I may have told Mr. Alvarez, and Mr. Alvarez may have told his niece, and his niece may have told half the landscaping crew, and after that, well, information in a small town travels faster than emergency vehicles and with less respect for stop signs. Bellamy residents started asking questions. Why were dues going up? Why had the association paid legal fees over a cottage that was not even part of the neighborhood? Why was Denise sending letters about fiscal responsibility when she had caused the problem by pretending a private parcel was hers to manage? By late summer, the board held an open meeting, and I went, not because I had to, but because curiosity is a powerful thing, and also because I had bought a nice blouse that made me feel like I could survive fluorescent lighting. Denise stood at the front of the room with her usual polished calm, but it did not land the same anymore. People were restless. A retired teacher in the second row asked whether the association had authority over legacy parcels. A younger couple asked if their dues had covered legal expenses related to my meter. Paul stared at his papers like they might open into a hole and let him escape. Finally, someone asked Denise directly, "Did you authorize the disconnect?" She paused, and in that pause the whole room understood the answer before she gave it. She said, "I authorized a service action based on the information available at the time." And from the back of the room, Mr. Alvarez, who had absolutely no business being there and every right to enjoy himself, said, "That is a lot of words for yes," and did not laugh. I wanted to. My soul laughed, but my face behaved. 3 weeks later, Denise resigned as association president, citing personal reasons, which is the traditional phrase people use when the reasons are extremely public. The new board sent me one letter, short and almost human, confirming my property would not be contacted regarding Bellamy standards again. The utility separation finalized in November. My account returned to my name. My escrow was applied to my actual charges. Bellamy absorbed the restructuring costs, the legal fees, and, from what I heard, a very uncomfortable annual budget meeting. The day my separate bill arrived in the mail, I carried it out to the porch with a cup of coffee. The lake was silver that morning, quiet and flat, and the lavender had gone woody at the stems because I had neglected it during all the chaos. My ceramic frog was still by the steps, sun-faded and ridiculous, facing the road like a tiny, ugly guard dog. I remember sitting there for a long time, not feeling victorious exactly. Victory sounds loud. This felt quieter than that. It felt like getting your breath back after realizing you had been holding it for months. I thought about Denise, and I know people want a story like this to end with the villain crushed and the hero glowing in golden light. But real life is messier. I do not think Denise woke up every morning wanting to be cruel. I think she believed order was the same thing as goodness. I think she believed money made a neighborhood more legitimate than history. I think she saw my house, old and stubborn, outside her rules, and felt personally insulted by the idea that something could exist near her authority without belonging to it. That is dangerous, not because it is rare, but because it is common. People do it in neighborhoods. Offices, families, churches, everywhere. They confuse influence with ownership. They confuse preference with principle. They confuse being annoyed with being wronged. And if nobody stops them, they start reaching for switches they were never meant to touch. So yes, in the end, my lights stayed on, my frog stayed put, and Bellamy Shores paid a very expensive lesson in boundaries. But I still wonder what would have happened if I had been someone without boxes of paperwork, without a stubborn streak, without Nora, without the time to sit at a county records desk and read the fine print line by line. Would they have called it compliance then? Would everyone have nodded and moved on? That is the part I cannot laugh off. So now I want to ask you, honestly, if you were in my shoes, would you have pushed for peace the moment the power came back? Or would you have followed the paper trail all the way until the people who crossed the line had to admit where the line actually was? And bigger than that, when a community claims it is protecting property values, how far is too far before protection turns into control? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because I know some people will say I should have settled quietly, and others will say I did not go far enough. Tell me where you stand. Who was right, who was wrong, and whether justice is still justice when it comes with a little bit of perfectly earned irony.